no longer be taken seriously. So he changed jobs and became what he called a pitchman. He was hired by General Electric. Yeah, some of us will remember that he was the host for GE Theater. Used to be on Sunday nights. But more than that, what his job was, he drove himself in his station wagon all over the United States, and he would stop at General Electric facilities. He would meet the management, and then they'd take him in, and he'd walk the production lines. He'd give a pep talk, and he would tell those production line workers why what they were doing was important to America. Make them feel good about their jobs. Not the kind of path you'd think would ever lead to the White House, but years later he did say, when he was asked, where did you get the amazing ability to communicate with rank-and-file Americans? He says, walking those production lines, listening, knowing who they were, what their concerns were. Let me tell you how their two are alike in a way that few presidents can match. Both of them, it seems, had the inability to ever hold a grudge. Some of you know, Pam and I have spoken about a wonderful book called Team of Rivals, written by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's about the convention of 1860 and the people who were trying to get the presidential nomination, and Abraham Lincoln ended up with it, an absolute underdog. Nobody thought it was going to happen. And people like William Henry Seward, and Salmon P. Chase, and Edgar Bates, who were really favored to win the nomination, had been knocked off by his favorite son. The convention was held in Chicago that year. Abraham Lincoln. They were furious with Lincoln. And yet somehow Lincoln never took their anger personally. He worked with them, he cajoled them, he pandered them, if you will, flattered them, and ultimately brought each of them into his cabinet. And together they saved the country. I'll give you an even better example. In 1853, when the lawyer Lincoln was trying to kind of broaden from debt collection law, he was trying to picture himself as a corporate lawyer. He got on with a case, he was signed on retainer. The case is known as McCormick Reaper. McCormick Farm Implements, ultimately it became. They had a patent infringement case. They were forming a team of lawyers all over the country. Lincoln got signed on to be a retainer, and they told him to go meet with the chief lawyer, and they sent him down to Cincinnati. He was interviewed by the lead lawyer, whose name was Edwin Stanton. Stanton interviewed him for 15 minutes and fired him on the spot. Called him a second-rate lawyer from a second-rate town, Springfield, Illinois. Did Lincoln hold a grudge? No. It was that same Edwin Stanton that 11 years later stood at the bedside in the Parker boarding house across from Ford's Theater the moment Lincoln died and said, now he belongs to the ages. The guy who had fired Abraham Lincoln was in fact hired by Abraham Lincoln to be Secretary of War. And along with Seward and Lincoln, probably those three people truly did save the country. Ronald Reagan, he didn't hold a grudge. You know, when he set out to run for the presidency in 1976, he upset a lot of Republicans. Because we had a Republican president, his name was Gerald Ford. And when Reagan didn't like the way Ford was going, he thought he'd become too moderate, thought he was losing his way, came out against him and almost beat a sitting president in the primary process, and a lot of Republicans were beating up on Reagan every day for daring to take on a sitting Republican president. In 1980, when he was running then in the primary, he laid out his economic system that he called supply-side economics. And some of the candidates who were running against him for the presidential nomination, who were Republicans, called it voodoo economics, fuzzy math. One of the campaign managers for one of those candidates said Ronald Reagan was just too old to be president, wasn't capable of serving, clearly didn't have what it takes because he was just an actor. That last person was James Baker, who was ultimately hired by Reagan to be Secretary of State and served as his Chief of Staff. By the way, the guy who called Reagan's economic policies voodoo economics, you've heard of him too. George Herbert Walker Bush, the person Ronald Reagan chose to be his vice president. incapable of holding a grudge. And by the way, for all of you who stood here tonight in those primaries, remember those words? It's not personal. It's not. You know, those two men had great similarities, but their greatest similarity was in their ability to communicate and to do it in tough times. No president has ever gone through the type of 4 years that Abraham Lincoln went through as president. Think of this. 3% almost of the American population died during the Lincoln presidency in the Civil War. It would be like having a September 11th, 2001 event once a week, each week, for 4.5 years. 3,000 people dying every week, every week, every week. It was a time of incredible grief. And yet, it was Abraham Lincoln who used his words to bring people up time and time again. When it looked like the Congress of the United States was going to defund the war, Lincoln spoke to them and said, "The dogma of our quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. As the occasion is piled high with difficulty, we must rise to the occasion. We must think anew, we must act anew, and then we shall save our country. For the fiery trials through which we pass shall forever write us in honor or dishonor to the last generation. For we shall either nobly win or meanly lose. This, the last best hope of earth." Those words brought the Congress back. There was that incredible November 19th, 1863. Lincoln stood at Gettysburg and gave that most quoted speech ever given in the English language, the Gettysburg Address. But if you just think of it for its 272 words, you miss its real meaning. This is going to take a moment, but always from now on, from this day forward, when you hear the words Gettysburg Address, I want you to think of the mental image that I hope to paint right now. You know, the Battle of Gettysburg was actually many battles that occurred over 3 days in July. July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. It was hot, humid. And during those 3 days, almost 10,000 Americans died at that little town. The town of Gettysburg consisted of just 2,400 people. And with 10,000 Americans lying dead in the wheat fields and the orchards around Gettysburg, the people of Gettysburg didn't know what to do because the army was quickly on its way. So they did what they had to do because it was July and it was hot. They had teams of oxen pull plows, and they would go out and open up a strip of land in what's called a dead furrow, that first plow strip. And then they'd go back and go over it again and over it again, and they'd dig it deeper and deeper. And then they started putting the bodies in because it was July. They covered them back up very quickly. They had no more than gotten done with that duty than they realized, wait a minute, this is not right. The sacrifice that happened here is something greater than we've ever seen, and it deserves more than trenched graves. A lawyer in the town whose name was Wells led the effort. He called the federal government and said, you know, I've got some land I would like to donate for a new national cemetery. Even back then, the government reacted way too slowly. It wasn't until the 1st of October that they took title to the land. And so now it's October, and they went out and started digging new graves, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And then they exhumed the bodies from the wheat fields, and the cornfields, and the orchards around Gettysburg. It is said when Abraham Lincoln spoke on that November 19th at the dedication of the cemetery, the scent of fresh earth was still in the air from the newly turned graves. And then, in that setting, while undoubtedly thousands of people who had traveled hundreds, if not thousands of miles to be there for their loved ones' interment, stood weeping. In 272 words, Abraham Lincoln described what this country was, where it had come from, what it was at that day, and what with God's blessing it will forever be.